We are gathered here today to talk about The Souls of Black Folk, the 1903 book by W.E.B. Du Bois. And I was thinking that we could all start by just introducing ourselves, since folks may be watching this conversation later. So I'm Sherlanya.
And I'm Lauren.
I'm Lucy.
Oh, and I think...
I'm Heidi.
Excellent. So, The Souls of Black Folks, 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois. Anyone who's taken a American history class in college, I think, is familiar with the name. I think that we may even be familiar with the name from high school. I don't know. I can't remember anymore because those details are... I am entering the age where those details are now becoming fuzzy. So I was thinking that we might start our discussion today. I guess I'm curious about like what your experience with W.E.B. Du Bois and The Souls of Black Folks, this work, has been.
I can start. So I read this book in graduate school as part of my studies, and it was definitely on my reading list. I was working on 19th century American literature, and I particularly ended up focusing on African American literature. So that was something that, was pivotal reading, and I ended up doing more research on Du Bois because I was focusing on like intersections between race and gender in the classics in 19th century America and how that kind of impacted ideas about citizenship. So Du Bois was kind of a big figure for that. So this book has been percolating kind of through my thoughts for the past 8 or 10 years.
Thank you.
Maybe I should just step in and say I'm on the far other end of this spectrum of, familiarity with Du Bois. I knew of the name, but he was not assigned reading for me at any point in my studies. I believe that, somehow, maybe through the zeitgeist, the term talented 10th and Du Bois kind of reached me. So I was aware of this, African American intellectual who was very vocal about bringing a certain, developing or cultivating a certain class of Black American. That was the extent of it before. Recently, I think I participated in one of these conversations with you, Sherlanya, about Stamped from the Beginning, and Dr. Ibram X. Kendi has a analysis of the figure of Du Bois and his legacy. And I remember talking with you, Sherlanya, and just kind of feeling like I felt like it was a kind of a harsh judgment on Du Bois without, I should crucially point out, ever having read The Souls of Black Folk or any of Du Bois's readings. Books myself. So I've done that now, except I didn't finish the last 4 chapters of this book. So I wanted to get that out of the way. Come clean too.
That happens. Books are like that. So you get through what you get through in the time you have.
Well, I guess I'll add then. So I read this book, like Lauren. It wasn't something that was required reading for me, and Du Bois's name was familiar to me, and probably in connection with the talented 10th. I read this book earlier in the year, and then I read Stamped from the Beginning, and I was at that conversation as well. And I think what struck me about this book when I read it was that he wrote it in 1903, and this is a man who lived till 1968. So it's like, I thought, I'm just getting a tiny bit of what someone's thinking at one particular point in his life. So I sort of became interested in learning a little bit more about W.E.B. Du Bois. And it's interesting, I have a copy where Ibram Kendi does the introduction, and he's very, he speaks very highly of Du Bois. So I think kind of to what you're saying, Lauren, like people can be more than one thing or carry more than one thought in their brain at one time. But I reread it again recently for this discussion. So it's been something that I've been thinking about a lot recently.
So my undergraduate degree was in history. I've said that for people who've been in these discussions before. And a lot of the classes that I took sort of rolled over different elements of, brought up Du Bois at one point or another. And I know that I read this book for one of my classes. And I can't remember which one it was, but I think it might have been like an American intellectual history class. And and I had been familiar with, the Talented 10th, and a lot of the times that I was exposed to Du Bois, it was in contrast to Booker T. Washington. I think that that's one of the common framings within the context of a history course. But upon reading this book very recently, I felt like, I know that I read this book. I know that this is one of the books that I read, right? But when I'm reading it now, I just don't remember that much of it. Like, I did not recall that there was a short story in this book. And I did not recall being sort of taken with his use of language. And that's just interesting. And some of that is like, for me, it's like, are you just a different reader than you were then, which you probably should be nearly 20 years later, right? But it just made me think about what is the role of education really, right? Because like so many of us leave high school and then go directly into like an undergraduate experience, which is like the framing of like us becoming like formally recognized as having like an education. And what does it mean to read these things when you're 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, when your experience with them may be entirely different as a more realized adult. And I wasn't expecting to go down that road at all. But I felt that so strongly as I was reading this work over the last couple of days. So this is interesting because we're all like sitting on very different branches of this tree as we think about this work. So I guess that one thing I'm super curious about is like, as you're working through this material or reworking through this material, as it may be, what stood out to you generally? And then what stood out to you from this like 2020 moment?
Well, I would say right off the bat, one thing that stood out to me is just his use of language, and especially like rereading it the second time through. There are just passages that kind of stop you in your tracks. I felt that he's a very powerful writer, and that this book has kind of a big scope of material in it. Like at some points he's getting really into the nitty gritty of numbers and specifics, and this many people graduated, from this school. And then he has these chapters about his young son. And it's just like, so that's just something that struck me and has stuck with me since reading it.
I wanted to say, also that the language really stands out in this book, and sometimes I have to admit it got in the way, or there's a moment where it ended up being one of my favorite chapters among the ones that I read. It was the last one I read, number 9. It starts with this sentence: "The world-old phenomenon of the contact of diverse races of men is to have new exemplification during the new century." And I was like, well, okay, I have to turn my brain on here. It was, so there are these sentences that seem like harder for me to get at, but then later in the chapter, there's just some real, you talk about 2020, these moments of like, oh, okay. making a connection between the historical legacy of a legal apparatus in the South that is designed to capture fugitive slaves or to punish fugitive slaves, that then turns into the modern police state of the South, and thinking, wow, okay, this is making a connection to present day conversations. And so it felt incredibly accessible in that way. Yeah.
I would agree. Just the other day, my dad said to me that he was talking with a friend and had learned about how the sort of criminalization of just being Black in the South during the post-Reconstruction period led to imprisonment and then convict labor and that whole history. And he said, I never really knew that history, but I can imagine what impact it's had on relationships between African American communities and the police. And I was like, yeah, I think some of the sort of deep origins of the state of race relations in the country can be, we can find them in Souls of Black Folk. Like we can see some of those narratives and origins taking shape. Something that surprised me about this book, or interested me, and continues to kind of pull at me, is like the different genres that are in there, especially the songs at the beginning of each chapter. It's just really like, I don't have a way to really place them or talk about them, but it really interests me.
Yeah. One of the things that I was reading a little bit about this book, I can't remember if it was in the introduction of the version that I was reading or something else that I was looking at and thinking about having this conversation today. But when it was talking about specifically these, in the book, there's like a quotation from, something considered to be like of the Western canon. And then there's also like the musical representation of these sorrow songs. And then whatever I was reading was suggesting that, while in this book he's talking about lifting the veil, that maybe this was also like a way of like putting that veil in your face, right? By like just framing like a little part of the music that he doesn't identify in any other way than by the notes, and then like shows that there's like a lack of access to that song. That's how I interpreted what I was reading. And I thought that was a little bit interesting to think about, right? Because like if you step back from that, though, that would mean that you would need to be able to look at this music and understand exactly what it is that you were looking at when you looked at the like chords and rests and notes and staffs, And I thought it was interesting, something, but I do think that it functions to make you stop and look at this stuff right before each one of these chapters. But I also think that it functions to establish him in 1903 as a learned man, right? Like, because I think that, like when he's writing, he's got to remind you all the time, he's like, I'm trusting you to stay with me, but here's my credentials. Here are my papers. Please stay with me. And I felt like that was present throughout this work. But that's one of the things I never would have thought about reading this as an undergraduate, right? Like if you're like in college and you're at a point where you're like, I'm learning and like I'm one of the people who's like doing the things, like you're not thinking about like the work that he's needing to do in order to establish himself as somebody worth listening to.
Yeah, you're right. That really jumped out at me, but I didn't really make that connection that you had of thinking about how this man really needed in his place and time to show you his credentials, And so like I don't often hear references to like the myth of Atalanta or, words like parvenu or other than I had to have my dictionary next to me for this book. I definitely did. 'Cause it was like, okay. But I think that makes sense, that we could look at this as, this is someone trying to say, okay, I'm learned. I'm someone who has thought deeply about this, and I have a powerful command of the English language and culture. And he can make references to, I don't know, places around the world and draw those references to the South. And yeah.
At the same time, though, it doesn't feel forced to me. Like, it feels like this is part of my learning and my worldview, like these different references. But I'd be interested if it felt differently to others, because I have sort of a particular angle on it and thoughts about that. So,
I wanted to react to that, Heidi, and say, this is like kind of personal to me, because I remember writing my first essay in college and getting it back. And my professor's comment was, "You're obviously generally literate. However, you are not some arch tweedy, port swilling, cigar chomping British aristocrat. So you don't need to write like one." And it really like knocked the wind out of me. So it's kind of like what you're saying here, Heidi, of like, it doesn't feel forced. It doesn't like, Du Bois is putting on a facade or anything. Like, this is his voice. And it's clear.
I think that the short story supports that, actually, right? Because he tells a story about John, who went to go and get education, and then he buckled down and he was changed by the experience. But it's only when he went back home and went to church and said the things that he said in order to like try to do the thing that he felt was correct in his heart to bring uplift to his community, and then offended everybody, that he was able to see that his perspective had been changed, right? And so I think that the presence of that work of fiction supports that, like, his voice is what it is, and that learning and your education and your experiences do change your voice. But I also think that he was hyper aware. I think that all of these people who are like writing were hyper aware of what they're doing. I think that these two things overlap for him. And one of the things that I read in the introduction of the copy that I was reading actually took on this idea of the conflict between him and Booker T. Washington. And it's like, well, actually, at the time where he was writing this, like, Booker T. Washington is like this, it's presented in history classes as if it's like George Foreman and like Muhammad Ali getting ready to like rumble, right? Like they're like these two big names, and like everybody's wanting to see what's going on, but they were in different positions. And that's something that hadn't been, I never realized that, just because of the way that they were, presented as like these two. And I think that he was in part, like getting into that ring on purpose, right? Like if you're making criticism about somebody who's like farther along, I think that that's a political choice, perhaps.
I think, well, and the way he does it in the chapter about Booker T. Washington, I mean, he very much like, I think this supports what you're saying, like the way he breaks it down, like, Booker T. Washington is asking folks to give up these things, and then these three things are happening. I mean, he frames his argument. It is like he's intentionally stepping into that ring, but he's doing it. It seems like he's doing it with like all of his notes behind him, like, here's the fight I'm picking with you, and I'm going to break it down really carefully.
That essay, I had to like stop for a second. Like when he's like, Booker T. Washington is the most famous man since one Jefferson Davis. Seriously? Yeah. I was like, I gotta go like get some water or something, because that like, again, like as a younger person, I think I probably just read past that. But I'm like, What? You are uttering this man's name at the same time as the president of the Confederacy? Petty Olympian, maybe? Like, what is happening here? But then I was like, well, like, if you're trying to make a splash, if you're trying to get your name out there, if you're trying to do your thing, but what?
Yeah, there's that conciliatory, if that's the right word for it, kind of like a tone of being like, well, on the one hand, these people are struggling for their freedom, but I totally get, the white people down in the South who are trying to just make sure their society doesn't completely, burn down. I get that too. Like there is that sort of, that tone that comes through in several of these stories or essays.
I think that some of that is part of what Dr. Kendi was talking about, and also like when I was reading this, like I was hyper aware of his physical descriptions of people, and thinking about like how like ideas of colorism play into like every time he described somebody as having hard hair, I was just like, oh, whoa, like just with a modern ear, that feels that felt real weird for me to listen to. You know what I mean? Because like he never was like, and the stately man with hard hair, you know what I mean? It was just like some of these physical attributes that were, darker, coarser hair. I felt like, I don't know. Mm-hmm. It was interesting. And it was interesting to see so much. It was interesting to me to see so much of that in this book that wasn't about that. The other thing in language that he did that I was with a modern ear, I was like, I wasn't expecting this. And it may be just like I haven't done enough reading in this time period, right? Because like you read this and it's clearly written when it was written, but like I wasn't expecting to be jarred by the word abortion more than once in this book, right? Like I was like, what was the technology even at that point? And like, what were people thinking about when they're using that word and using that term? Like when he was like making comparisons to social things and using that. And then there's like a gendered nature to his language that again was very jarring, I guess, to a 2020 year, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also thinking about how something that jumped out to me, which might be a little related to what you just said. It doesn't directly get at what you just said, but sometimes he'll talk about civilization, right? And he's referring to Western civilization, right? And there's this love of Western civilization or some of the culture of Western civilization that does come through. And yet it feels a bit more nuanced, maybe like upon like just more of like a slower reading and being like, okay, wait a second. Because like in the one of the first sentences of that chapter 9 that I like so much of the sons of master and man, he's talking about, well, okay, like characteristic of our age is this contact between the West and uncivilized peoples, or he calls them undeveloped peoples. And you go, what? And to the 2020 era, that's like, whoa, wait a second. And then it goes on to say like, well, like, whenever Western civilization interacts with these undeveloped peoples, then there's just this trail of war and murder and slavery and extermination that just seems to come along with that. And it almost feels like just like, so wait, Western civilization always creates these conditions in its wake wherever it, trails around the globe. So that's just something. And it makes me wonder, like, if he really means undeveloped, or what does that actually mean? Is he being sarcastic there? Do you know what I mean?
It's interesting too, like thinking about that idea. And then like, I mean, we were in 1903 when we're with this book, but then when we think about the entire trajectory of his life and like how his thinking changed and how he was like, I can't even live here anymore. You know, it feels interesting to think about that, knowing what came later for him, you know. And then like, when we think about like the idea of the double consciousness, right? Like if you overlay like these ideas about, you know, here's this man who's clearly of Western society, right? But then he's also able to see like the impact of that society when it makes contact with others. You know, like is that a part of what does that fall on what side of the veil does that fall on, right? To like borrow from his other metaphor, question mark. I don't know. I mean, when I think about him now, having read this more recently and thinking about the way that he gets framed, I see a man who's just looking for like space to be, which feels very different than the way that he gets like pitched against Booker T. Washington, right? Because like if you're talking about him being pitched against Booker T. Washington and being critical of like the idea of casting down your bucket where you are and the idea of like people pursuing, you know, agricultural and more like working class type roles, that feels one way. But like here's this man who clearly has had a hunger for like learning and like thinking in the way that his brain was clearly built to think. You know, there's like, you know, like, yeah, my heart goes out to somebody who's just looking to find space for himself to exist as the man he knows himself to be in his society.
Mm-hmm. I have something to say to that or react to that, but I would like to shut up a second.
I think you should say it if you have it. I mean, unless you don't want to, but.
All right, I'll say it. Which is, I mean, I think that comes out in this book, right? Like there are parts in which Du Bois is saying like really explicitly, like, first of all, his love of education shines throughout the book, period. Just his love of education and his passion for learning shines throughout this book. I'm thinking of that chapter where he's like going on a tour of somewhere in, I don't know, like the Black Belt of the South, somewhere in Tennessee or something, like out in the sticks. And he encounters a young woman named Josie, who is like just kind of stuck on a farm, you know, like stuck in just a world of drudgery and toil. And just, this is life, you know, we're trying to scratch out a living on the side of this hill type of a life. And yet she is hungry. And he sees that, like he's saying, hey, I'm, you know, a traveling itinerant young teacher guy. Do you guys want a schoolhouse? And she's like, yes. I mean, she is so excited for this. And it's really, I don't want to give anything away, but it's a really interesting story, you know, and just a very visceral story. And later in the book, he says stuff like, you know, I don't want this focus to be on making money and materialism. I want, you know, the Black community, all people really, all Americans to focus away from, you know, whatever, the throne of Mammon or whatever he calls it. But like into just, what do we want? We don't want money. We want fellow feeling. We want fellowship. Like there's this moment where I was like, wow. I mean, there's a huge critique of, I think, the way I read this book, capitalism and like a current economic, the structure that persists to this day, you know, where he's saying like, we don't want alms. We don't want handouts. We don't want cash. We want character. You know, we don't want like sympathy. We want like the pulse of hearts beating with red blood. We want love. Like, whoa. And I think that kind of gets to what you were just saying, Sherlani, about like, I want to just be able to live life. I don't want And what is a full life, right? Like, I want to live my fullest life, and I want everyone else to be able to do the same.
Yeah, it made me think about like how people's ideas about what they want is just are just different. You know what I mean? Like like for some people, like having this, for some people, education's a high high priority, and it's like it's thing. And for some people, like being well read is a thing, but like you're not less of a person if that's not a thing for you, right? And like for somebody else, like going to work and working really hard all day and working with your hands and working with your body and seeing what you created with your own hand, like that brings value to somebody else. And these two things, they don't always have to be at odds. These two ideas can exist at the same time. And this book reminded me of that. Right. And I think that sometimes, that can get lost in like survey courses, right? Where you're just being exposed to snippets of a moment in time in somebody's thought. But it's like one of those situations where it's like, well, yeah, like these things can all be true at the same time. And like, not everybody's like, we don't all have the same factory parts, right? Like some people can't. I get lost in space. You spin me around 3 times, I'm like, I have no idea where I am, right? And so like anything that has to do with that at all is just not the right fit. You know what I mean? And that doesn't make me any less or any more than the next person. And this book made me think about that a lot, in the way that, just because it kind of touched on like ideas about like what's valuable and what's not, right? Like when he's talking about people with less education, I think it's like super complicated, right? Because like on one side, like you've got this whole class of people, this whole race of people who were like deliberately denied this thing, right? But like in any group, not everybody, that's not the right fit for everybody. So like how do you digest that, and how do you make that all make sense? Or one thing like with the 2020 year, especially like a pandemic, lots of people working from home 2020 year, that stood out to me. It's like when he went and he was like visiting where people were, and he was like describing people's like state of dress and things, and he was looking at it through a certain lens. And I was like, yeah, how many of us are looking like that right now when we're working and we don't expect to see anybody, right? Like, do you look the same every day when you work right now as you do when you're gonna like go into the office, right? And if somebody like dropped by your house, and like you could totally be doing what you're doing in whatever job that you are, looking like, in comparison to like normal times, would be just like in disarray. And if somebody like came in and were describing you, what conclusion are they going to reach, right? And this moment made me think about that a little bit differently. Like if you're doing a bunch of stuff and you know that you're about to go, this is 1903, so it's not like they had their like Clorox wipes to do the cleaning. Like we don't know what these people were about to do when he's happening upon them. And again, like reading it in this moment made me think about that a little bit differently than I would have. Says she who changed clothes before doing this because I knew it was going to be recorded. I was like, I can't wear that sweatshirt I had on a minute ago. But what would he have thought, like if he stopped by, right? And if we moved him into 2020, he'd have been like, this person clearly is in need of some adjustment, right?
Yeah.
It got quiet, so I'm going to look at my notes.
Yeah, quiet's good.
So what did you guys think about the short story in here?
Well, it's kind of, like just as a short story in and of itself, it's kind of gutting. I felt, just what happens in the story. It's kind of tough in the end. But it was interesting to hear what you were saying about him putting it in there as sort of like a framework for it, like using a different voice to describe maybe what he himself had learned through getting educated and then trying to share his education. It's an interesting device to stick in the middle of a book like this. I liked it.
One of the things I was thinking about when reading the story is I don't remember what course it was, but he wrote at least one novel. I don't know how, like he wrote a lot of things. I'm by no means an expert in his writing, but I remember in one of my classes hearing a professor describe his novel Dark Princess as like a terrible novel. And I actually read it and wrote a paper on it. And maybe it was like the paper was on it and something else, but I liked him as a novelist. And I was reminded of that here when I was reading this story. And then it was just, again, like with a more like later, I'm like, well, what did that critique mean? Right? Like, because it wasn't detailed, and it's coming from the point of view of a fellow like academic, right? And I was like, are you a failed novel? Like as an adult, I'm like, are you just a failed novelist and you're mad that this guy was able to like be a father of sociology, write a bunch of stuff, write history and write a novel? Or do I just like this guy's writing enough that maybe I can't see that the novel wasn't good? It just made me think about how our own identities and how we bring who we are to somebody's writing, right? And then I feel like just like as a part of the work, I think that it did some, I feel like one of his things was to try to demonstrate that Black people have interior lives. And I think that like this novel, like this short story did that, right? And so like you go into the short story and you're like, the conventions of fiction make you contemplate the internal lives of the characters. And by putting this in the book, then I think he's just like making us, contemplate the internal lives of all of these other people who we saw and all of these other experiences who we saw and all of these people who were impacted by the negligence of the Freedmen's Bureau and the mismanagement and all of that. Like by him putting the short story where we see in great detail the internal life of these folks is making us do that. And I think he did it again through his, his grief story of losing his son, right? Like you get this, he does it himself a little bit in this work when he's like characterizing people according to racial stereotypes. Like when he's talking about people being lazy at some points, or like when he's talking about like, this carefree thing, he's like dealing in some of these tropes. But like when you are watching this story about this man who lost the son who he loved, like it's impossible to not see him as a human person who's like feels the full range of feelings. And he did it with his wife as well, right? Like there's not a piece of clothing that this child wore that was not worried by the fingers of her, and she smiled upon him as he nursed, you know what I mean? Like he really was like, you will not leave this book not understanding that Black people are people who experience the entire range of emotions that you, dear reader, experiences. Again, never would have thought about that as a 19, 20, 21-year-old. Perhaps you all were more sophisticated and empathetic readers than I was as a younger person.
Well, no, I mean, I think like the chapter about his son, when I was reading it again, and I'm thinking how much of this affects me also because I'm a parent, it just really, there's so many levels that he is reaching out and like connecting and kind of saying, this is the range of life and emotions that Black folks live. And, you know, it's, I mean, something about that chapter was very moving and sad. But then I kept thinking, like, if I read this chapter when I wasn't a mother, like, you know, when I was in college, would it have struck me in the same way? I don't know.
I mean, I really appreciated just the range of different types of writing and reflection that make up the book. So like the personal story about the loss of his son. I feel like people at the time could have leveled against him. Well, you've had it pretty easy. Like, what do you know about the suffering that you're talking about? Not that that was the case, not that he had to have experienced losing a son to feel that, but because he was able to get an education and had certain access to things like that. I feel like in some ways bringing in that personal story and then that sort of the short story too, the sort of inner reflection that you're talking about, Shalanya, I think really helped kind of personalize it, and in a way helps him like claim like being this type of spokesperson almost for being able to say, well, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, just kind of taking on that authority.
What does it feel like to read that line today? You know, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line.
That problem has stuck around.
Mm-hmm.
It's the problem of the 21st century. Yeah.
That's one of the things that was really weird to me reading this. Like the last time I was reading this was around 20 years ago, right? But like to be like, you know, 100 years and change, you know what I mean? That feels different even than like 100 years, you know what I mean? And it's just so weird on one side, but then I think about, I've been thinking about the place of time when we think about matters that have to do with like race in America, because in some ways, like we Americans like to play with time a little bit when we're talking about race, right? Like, everybody's always talking about like the founding and like the Declaration of Independence and stuff like that. Like it's a recent past, like we reach back to that. And just like bring it out, like this is so relevant, this thing that happened, right? And that puts us back in 1776, right? Or, you know, around that era, you know, some before, some after, depending on what you're talking about. But when we talk about like the Civil War and the end of slavery, which is like 1860s, we talk about that like that's like so far ago that we can't imagine, but like 1776 is near, you know, 1865 is far. And so like when I'm thinking like, oh man, here we are, you know, roughly 120 years after this was written, like why am I even thinking that when I know that we play fast and loose with time? Right. And so like, then it made me think about like, well, what else was written at this time? And like, what would we feel about those other words that are talking about social issues that impact us today? Question mark. I did not have the time to like I didn't make the time to go in and do that. But like as I thought about like how contemporary some of these words felt, it just really made me think about the way that we like stretch and retract that rubber band when we're positioning ourselves to things that have to do with like our national history with race. Right. Or like we talk about, like when we talk about the history of race, like we want to go to emancipation and then forget about the 100 years between emancipation and the modern civil rights acts, like the 64, the 65, the 68. Like we just hop around in time in this like sliders like way. And what else do we do that around? You know?
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying here, and it's making sense to me. You know, like I'm thinking as you're talking about like all the sort of history and culture, communication and like touchstones that we just forgot about, like socially as a society. It's like we don't want to think about how pivotal the movie Birth of a Nation was to our national psyche. We don't want to think about how that like that was the first film that was screened in the White House, you know, about the Ku Klux Klan, and that was what 10 years after The Souls of Black Folk was published, and Reconstruction for sure was just like, I don't know, it's out of sight, out of mind. At least that's my personal experience of it with you know, how I learned about it in high school, you know, and it wasn't this very messy, like, okay, hold on a second, this is a huge moment in history, and let's really try to take our time to unpack this, right? It's not like emancipation and yay, okay, like, and not, maybe that's uncharitable of me to really think like that's how it was presented. I'm sure it was a bit more nuanced than that, but to me in high school. But really, that's one of the things I like about this book, is that there's a real like, let's slow down and like look at the past, whatever, 40 years since the Civil War. Let's look at how things changed over time. Let's take a moment here. I learned a lot from reading this book about that particular period of American history, which I think it's one of those it's not one of those lily pads when we're hopping around that we really spend time on.
He went on to write a book about Reconstruction, which is also interesting to think about, right? Because like that clearly is one of the things that he like lays out in this book. But like thinking about him, you know, there's a whole other story about like how that book came about, but like that's clearly something that he spent a lot of his life thinking about. And like I was reading about, I can't remember, and this may have been, it's like a passing thing that I read. It wasn't like some big thing that I read that, but it was talking about scholarship, like where are the holes, where could people do more scholarship. And it was like, well, that era following Reconstruction is like one area that like more work could be done. And that's, I don't know, I think it was probably like 2 sentences and then it like lingers, you know, and there were huge books about Reconstruction. And I think that if we would all learn more about the era, we would learn a lot about national identity, right? Like this idea of like who belongs where, like a lot of the like, you know, the economy, like you think about, I think that sometimes we think about race in a way that's divorced from economics. And I think that this book does a good job of marrying the issues. But I think that like when we think about Reconstruction, that's super clear, right? Because there are all these, there's like this post-war situation. There's the price of cotton doing all kinds of stuff, right? So like speculation that came from that. And just all of the economic factors that were like impacting people's daily lives, which again makes us think about today, right? Like you think about what's happening right now with this epidemic and like what ripples out and like how decisions made at one level are going to hit like some real human, or not going to hit, have been hitting real human beings and will continue to hit real human beings in these ways that we don't necessarily always think about when we're thinking about the politics. That was like a real meandering thought, but
no, I'm sorry, I'm gonna let someone else speak.
You can go ahead if you have a thought.
All right. I mean, I think just yes to that, and also shout out to the 1619 Project for also. I think that was a real clear-eyed, like, let's look at why why race still is a thing. Like, why is it that the problem of the color line is still a real big problem for us as Americans? Well, let's think about how slavery was primarily a system of economic exploitation. And let's think about how the 100-year period of Jim Crow that followed emancipation, followed the formal abolition of slavery here, is also in the mix there too. And I think those parts of this book really struck out to me as this feeling of like, oh, just utter hopelessness of there's no way that I'm, going to be able to get off this particular rock. And like, I have to, most people are kind of living a life of like, promising their crops of cotton in advance. And they're trying to get like a payday loan for whatever to survive. And just the amount of predation that is kind of in the mix there. And I like that Du Bois is like showing you he's not just rolling through and like, I don't know, interviewing the guy on the street. I mean, he's like spending time in these areas with these folks, and he's taking time to kind of assemble a sense of like a mind state and reporting on that and chronicling that. And like Lucy said, I mean, or somebody said earlier, like there's a staggering amount of statistics like in here that made me feel like, oh, okay, so like $1, like of every dollar, let's say like a certain amount goes to the education of whites, and a certain far less significant piece goes to the education of Black people. Okay, was this written like about today, or is this written about 100 years? Oh, okay, 100 years ago, this is what was the situation. And it's in some ways very striking how that persists, right? So I guess I said like shout out to the 1619 Project, because that was like it was a very important, for me, someone who hasn't spent a lot of time studying this in depth, like kind of a wake-up call of being like, let's trace the lineage. Let's take some time to do this and see how these social ills that we are confronting or not today have a real legacy here.
I kind of wanted to, this is maybe going back a little bit, but thinking about sort of touchstones in our sort of narrative of history, whether it's through schools or kind of how we think back and look back on the nation's history. One thing that kind of irks me, Sherlanya, you talked about, in your class, the framing was all about, well, Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington as the two major sort of leadership figures of this period. Like, where are the women in that? And it happens too with like civil rights, like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, like what? And there's so many figures that we don't kind of talk about at the forefront of these movements. So I just wanted to shout out a couple authors, Black women authors from Du Bois's era. Anna Julia Cooper, another major sort of intellectual figure. She was a teacher. She wrote A Voice from the South in the 1890s and taught at Washington, D.C. High School, M Street High School. Pauline Hopkins, a novelist from that era, wrote Of One Blood. And then I think if you're interested in kind of like following on the next step of maybe American history, following the souls of Black folk, a really interesting read would be Ida B. Wells' Crusade for Justice. And speaking of statistics, all of her work gathering statistics about lynching in America and her advocacy in her anti-lynching crusade, basically. So just some kind of, if folks are interested in reading more from this like general time period, I'd really recommend those.
Thanks, Heidi.
Yeah, thank you.
That one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that might be a good, so we've been kind of chewing on this for like our hour and have been trying to be better about like staying to that. But one thing that I love asking people is what did reading this book make you want to learn more about or want to put on your list for further reading?
Well, I want to read more or learn more about W.E.B. Du Bois, in that he, as I said before, like his life was so long, and you look at like he ended up in Ghana. I mean, kind of just totally a different person from who he is here. So that interests me. I'd like to read more about either what he wrote or about him. But I also just wrote down those names that Heidi gave us. I mean, Ida B. Wells, I had that, but the other two. So I'm going to look for those.
Kind of like to read more Du Bois too. I never read Dark Princess, and like sort of that vein of his work, and that would be really interesting.
And I obviously still have to finish this book, so I'm gonna start there.
So reading this, Lauren, you mentioned the 1619 Project, and I did find myself thinking about that book as I was reading this one, right? Having revisited this book after having read that material, but it made me think about the gifts of Black folk. And I wonder like what the experience of reading that book that talks about like contributions that Black people have made to America would be like to read. I've never read that, but I wonder what that would be like to read following the 1619 Project, because those ideas definitely run parallel, right? Because like 1619 Project is like, there's no America as we know it without Black people. And I suspect that the gifts of Black folks may go into may look at it kind of the same way. But again, I just know that it talks about, it's talking about like what have Black people like given to America. So I'm kind of interested now in taking a look at that. Though, Heidi, you made me feel like, you know what, you got like, I have a tendency to read men, and I've said that before, like I definitely lean in that direction, and I am aware that I lean in that direction, and I still like lean in that direction. And I do think that there's value in like making it's easy, you know what I mean? It's easy to like go there, right? Because like if you're like having conversations and you're just throwing these men out, not everybody, I guess one is saying a lot about like who they're talking to, but like you just like have things to talk about. You start talking about these women and nobody knows what you're talking about, right? And so I feel like I want to take on the challenge of like making a point to do more historic reading from women. They were super important, and their work is foundational. Like if you took all of those women out, like so much of what happened didn't happen, because like of the work that they're doing and like the conversations that they're facilitating and the other unseen work that they're doing, like it just doesn't exist. So I kind of was thinking like the gifts of Black folk is something I want to read, but I'm like, you know what? Maybe you need to put some of these dudes on ice and like pick up some. They'll be there. They're not.
Oh yeah.
Maybe
they will
pick up some of these other texts as well. I mean, and like in thinking about the list of books that are part of this discussion series, I definitely was mindful of that and wanted to make sure that it wasn't just male authors, but I had to be like that because I was like, if you just start choosing stuff, you will 100% like choose like this male syllabus that we're accustomed to. So I think
I'm like the complete opposite. Like I'm like, well, I guess I have to include so and so because important figure, blah blah blah. But
interesting. This actually made me think about like a cousin to that idea a little bit, right? Because he talks, I should not be diving back into this book, but he talks a lot about, like, I felt myself thinking about like both siderism, right? As I was thinking about this book, right? Because he would make these arguments and then he would be like, but of course people should be like industrious and blah, blah, blah. And just like echo these, and maybe he wasn't echoing the ideas because he likely held them. But like every time I read something like that, you know, like when we say, you know, like white people are hurt by racism, or as he would say, race prejudice, that's what we saw a lot of in this book. It's like, well, that is, I believe that. I believe that that is true. But I find myself more recently thinking like, yeah, but like white people don't have to be hurt by this thing in order for it to be a thing that we should all pay attention to, you know, and so like you made me think about that, like in thinking like, oh man, I gotta include this guy in this syllabus because I must. And then like I'm like, but do we have to, right? Like we've told this other story that we've accepted as a broad story, and eliminating all of the women, right? Like we should then be able to like believe that we're telling a fully realized story, but not feel like we must include these men, right? Like it puts us in the mindset of thinking about people in chunks, right? And then like we complicated it by thinking about like, wait a minute, where were the women in this area? And then like, what does it mean to, what do our different lenses look like? And I think that that's what like made me like grab all you guys and like hurdle us all down this rabbit hole, because it just thinking about like what chunks look like from the outside and from the inside, and like how every individual is going to look at it a little bit differently. But like when we're talking about it, we think that we're talking about a common thing, and then even in there, sometimes we are and sometimes we aren't. And then what does that mean? Or like even with Du Bois having written a book about Reconstruction, part of that was in response to the way that the story of Reconstruction was being told. And it was like, well, you know, like the situation where it's like, all right, like the story is being written and there are things about the way that the story is being written that are problematic, right? And so like some of what the origin story of that book has to do with the way that stories were being written. And then what does that mean, right? Because like here he was like writing the story of like how we will come to think about this era. He's like a classic in American history, you know, and he's written this history and is determining the way that we're thinking about this era, right? And like he's determining, you know, and like his words get used and like were used as most like people who gain any kind of prominence for different aims. Like, for example, like in this narrative where it's like Booker T. Washington versus W.E.B. Du Bois, and you're like being taught that like as a, like for me anyway, like thinking about that like as a Black student who's always been like a you know, like I'm good at being a student, you know, and so like I always felt defensive when I'm thinking about Booker T. Washington, because I'm like, well, like if you're somebody who's like always been a strong student, always been top of the class, like talent, like the idea of a talented 10th sounds like spot on. You know what I mean? Like if you're thinking about a way to approach a thing, you know, but like you're not thinking about like the larger picture of like how like pedigree and class and all these other things like fall into it, because you're not being taught that part of it, right? And so like who are the figures who we identify with, and what does that mean about like the way that we roll forward, right? Like as a more adult, it's like, well, there's room for everybody, and like everybody, like these people are not apolitical, they are doing something with their words, and they understand that they're maneuvering and making moves with their words, and they're trying to, like, they're acting both as individuals and as representatives and trying to meet their aims. Like, you've got a Booker T. Washington who's running a school. He wants money for his school. He wants a name for his school. He wants the students to do well. He's going to do what he has to do to meet those aims, which aren't necessarily the same, you know, like, which makes the boxing match not make as much sense. But like when you're a student, you know, and you're trying to like glide through all of these historical moments, you don't think about that. Like, one thing that like illuminated that to me in a way that it was like, like you learn about the Civil War and you learn about like the potato famine, and like you could totally like not realize that there's an overlap between these two big things that happened somewhere, you know what I mean? Like when we have all these folks who are like leaving Ireland, right? Like that's connected. Some of that's connected to like this famine that occurred, you know, and then like different ideas that like, we just don't, we don't usually have like a integrated way of looking at history, because like we tend to look at what we're looking at in a particular moment. And I just wonder how that impacts how we move forward. Question mark. I mean, you know, says she who has the luxury to sit around thinking about that. You know, I recognize that as well. Anyway, that was like, I tried to wrap it up like 20 minutes ago, and then I like abandoned that. Thank you guys for the conversation. You guys always make me think so much, which is fun. I think it's fun. And so I'm always glad to do that. And I'm grateful for everyone who reads these things and like jumps on in there.